Everyone laughed when the janitor boy picked up the marker, but seconds later, the entire room fell silent at his answer. No one paid attention to his presence in the room. Everyone was too busy with their expensive ties, crystal wine glasses, and presentations filled with complex charts. But just as all heads turned toward the giant screen, one small figure quietly swept the floor in the corner. His name was Nico. He was only 13 years old. That morning, the glossy white floor of the Langford Towers Grand Hall reflected the sunlight with pride. Behind all that luxury, Nico mopped the floor and emptied the nearly full trash bins. He wore a faded gray uniform with a tiny badge that read Backup Janitor. Meanwhile, on the glass podium in the front of the stage, a bald man in a black suit delivered his opening speech. His name was Mr. Langford, a billionaire known for his eccentricity. He wasn't just the owner of the skyscraper, but also the founder of the largest mathematics foundation in North America. "Ladies and gentlemen," Langford said, raising one hand, "today is not about who holds the longest title. Today I want to see who has the sharpest mind." Applause echoed throughout the room. Professors from prestigious universities straightened up in their chairs. Among them were an algorithm expert from Germany, a cryptographer from Oxford, and a few young mathematicians who recently went viral on social media. Langford pressed a small remote. The massive screen behind him lit up. A series of complex equations and unfamiliar notations appeared. His eyes narrowed. "This is the Langford problem," he said dramatically. $1 million to anyone who can solve it within the next hour. In the corner, Nico stopped sweeping. He stared at the screen, as if looking at a childhood dream coming back to life. Slowly, he pulled out a crumpled paper from his pocket and began copying part of the equation. No one noticed. All focus was on the impossible challenge just announced. Some participants immediately opened their laptops. Others scribbled in notebooks. The hall suddenly felt like an operating room, silent but full of pressure. Nico had no idea what $1 million prize meant. All he knew was that the numbers on that screen felt familiar, as if he had once imagined them during a long, cold night at the orphanage. The hall remained quiet. Only the sound of keyboards clicking and pens scribbling broke the silence. Tension filled the room as the best minds in mathematics tried to make sense of the problem displayed on the screen. Some shook their heads. Others frowned deeper with each passing second. Mr. Langford walked along the front row, occasionally glancing over shoulders, watching the efforts unfold. His expression remained unreadable. But inside, he was sure of one thing: no one would solve this. The Langford problem wasn't just difficult. It was designed to be unsolvable, at least not by anyone in the room. He had spent years crafting it, pulling elements from unsolved conjectures, abandoned theorems, and obscure number theory. He created it as a test of pride, a puzzle that only he believed had a path forward. At the back of the hall, Nico sat on a wooden stool near the equipment closet. He laid out a few napkins, a broken pencil, and the torn piece of paper he had copied the problem onto. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from focus. He had seen similar equations before, not in school, but from old books he found in trash bins behind the local university. Each night after cleaning shifts, Nico read until the hallway lights shut off. He taught himself logic, sequences, symmetry, and modular arithmetic. Most of it didn't make sense right away, but patterns stuck with him. Numbers felt like music. And this problem, this one was humming a tune he somehow recognized. Back inside the hall, a man with glasses stood up. "This problem is flawed," he said, holding his notebook in the air. "There's no continuity in the boundary assumptions." Langford smiled. "That's the point," he said calmly. "It's not meant to be solved with brute force or standard frameworks." Murmurs filled the room. Someone whispered, "He's just messing with us." Another chuckled. "It's a publicity stunt." Yet somewhere between the doubts and the egos, none of them noticed Nico had stood up. He walked slowly toward the empty whiteboard on the far left wall. It wasn't the main screen. It was a sideboard, used earlier for notes during a side presentation. The lights above it were slightly dim, but to Nico it was enough. He took a marker from the ledge, and without a word, he began to write. Line by line, he translated the giant equation from the screen onto the whiteboard. But unlike others, he didn't stop to scratch his head or consult references. His hands moved steadily. He wasn't just copying. He was adapting, simplifying, rebuilding it from a different angle. In the crowd, a woman turned and pointed toward the board. "Hey, what's that kid doing?" Heads turned. Some frowned. Others snorted. A few laughed outright. One man muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, great. Now the janitor wants to be a mathematician." The laughter grew louder. But Nico kept writing, his expression calm, eyes focused, lips pressed tightly together. His world, at that moment, was only numbers. He didn't hear the laughter. He didn't see Mr. Langford slowly walking toward him, watching every mark he made. The noise in the room was beginning to change. At first, it was filled with dismissive chuckles and scattered whispers. But now, silence started to spread from the edges, like a ripple moving inward. One by one, people turned their heads toward the sideboard where the boy was writing. Nico didn't stop. He had already filled half the board. His notation was different from what the others used. Simpler, but elegant. He broke the giant equation into small pieces, analyzing the flow, rerouting paths, isolating symmetry where others saw chaos. It wasn't just problem solving. It was almost like he was unraveling a story hidden inside the math. From the back of the room, Professor Meyer, a renowned lecturer in abstract algebra, narrowed his eyes. He stood up, adjusted his glasses, and walked slowly toward the whiteboard. He leaned forward slightly, trying to see the flow in Nico's process. And then his eyes widened. "And no," he mumbled. The person beside him asked, "What is it?" Meyer didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, as if pulled by invisible strings. Nico didn't flinch. He kept writing. One of his napkin notes was tucked into his sleeve. Occasionally, he glanced at it before marking the board again. The room had grown unnervingly still. Mr. Langford stood just a few feet behind Nico now. His face no longer carried the amused smile he had earlier. His brow was tense. He didn't speak. He simply watched. More professors approached. A few of them began murmuring, pointing at segments of Nico's solution. Someone whispered, "That's a reversal of the triple rotation matrix, but it's applied in negative field space." Another gasped, "He's mapping dimensional recursion through combinatorics. I haven't seen that method in years." One professor turned to Langford and asked in a low voice, "Did you teach him this?" Langford didn't answer. Instead, he stepped close to the board and read the last line Nico had just written. It was a bridge, a mathematical connection that bypassed two of the biggest assumptions in the Langford problem. Langford had tried to find that exact shortcut for 3 years. His hands clenched slightly behind his back. The last time he got that close to solving his own problem, he'd lost sleep for a month and walked out of a conference in frustration. And now this boy, this janitor, was approaching that same point. A journalist who had been covering the event noticed the growing crowd around the sideboard. He raised his camera and took a few shots. And that's when the flash went off. Nico paused. He turned slightly, startled. Everyone froze. The room, the professors, Langford, all eyes on him. Nico slowly lowered the marker and looked up at the man in the black suit now standing just inches from him. Mr. Langford's voice was soft. "Where did you learn this?" Nico blinked. "I didn't," he said. "I just followed the pattern. It made sense." Langford stared at him for a long moment, then turned toward the whiteboard again. He read every line from top to bottom. And finally, he whispered something no one had ever heard him say. "He's close." The moment Mr. Langford whispered those words, "He's close," a wave of confusion swept across the room. Scholars who had spent decades studying mathematics began pushing through the crowd to see what was written. Students, assistants, even staff members paused their conversations to catch a glimpse of the whiteboard that now held the attention of the wealthiest and smartest man in the building. Nico stood quietly beside it, marker still in hand, not knowing whether he should keep going or step back. Professor Meyer broke the silence. I think he's discovered a recursive identity I've never seen used like this." not in any published work. It simplifies the system without eliminating complexity. Another voice joined in. Professor Leung, a specialist in pure mathematics from Singapore. He's using child logic, she said, eyes wide, but in a refined form, the way children see patterns, but with the discipline of someone who's been through years of training. Someone scoffed. This is absurd. He's a janitor. He probably memorized this. Or someone coached him. Langford turned sharply toward the doubter. No one has seen this solution, he said with a cutting tone. Not even my top research assistants. He faced the board again. Nico, still unsure what to do, slowly took a step back. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he murmured. I just thought maybe it could work. Langford looked at him, then down at the napkin that had fallen to the floor from Nico's pocket. He picked it up. The handwriting was uneven, smudged, scrawled in pencil, but the math was sound. More than sound, it was raw, elegant, intuitive, a mind that saw numbers not as rules, but as stories. He turned to Nico. Where did you learn this kind of thinking? Nico hesitated, then answered quietly. At the dump, he said, behind Jefferson College. They throw away old books. I read the ones with lots of numbers. Some of them had weird shapes and symbols. I didn't know what they meant at first, but I kept trying. The room fell even quieter. Professor Leung asked softly, Do you know what topology is? Nico blinked. I think so. It's like folding paper, but in math. She stared at him for a long second, then turned to Langford. This boy doesn't just understand advanced mathematics. He feels it. Someone in the crowd began recording the moment on their phone. The boy, the board, the billionaire. No script could have written it better. Langford cleared his throat. His voice now carried a hint of tension. There's one part left, he said, pointing to the lower corner of the whiteboard. That's where everyone gets stuck. Even me. Nico looked at it. His eyes traced the space left at the bottom. His fingers twitched slightly. His lips moved silently, as if rehearsing. He stepped forward again, took the marker, and placed the first line of the final sequence. The crowd didn't move. The cameras didn't blink. Langford crossed his arms, watching, calculating, questioning everything he thought he knew about Genius class and the assumptions they all had made about the boy with the mop. Nico's hand hovered above the whiteboard. The room was silent, but his mind was not. In his head, variables danced. Numbers folded and unfolded like sheets of paper in the wind. There was no pressure, no audience, no billionaire behind him. Just a puzzle, just a pattern. He drew a line. Then another. The first row of the final sequence appeared. It wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't the approach used in textbooks or even among experimental theorists. It was something else, something personal. Professor Meyer leaned in, his breath caught in his throat. He's reframing the boundary conditions, he whispered. Not correcting the logic, rewriting it entirely. Nico kept going. His confidence grew with each stroke. The marker glided across the surface without hesitation. He no longer glanced at his napkin. The math was now flowing directly from his thoughts. Mr. Langford remained silent, but his fingers were gripping the back of a chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. More people joined the crowd. Some stood on chairs for a better view. One staff member turned off the projector on the main screen to remove glare, leaving only the light of the board and the boy who now owned the room. Nico paused briefly. His eyes traced back up through the logic. His lips moved silently again. Then he nodded to himself. He wrote one more symbol. It looked like the end of the sentence. Langford stepped forward slowly. He studied the final line and said nothing. The others in the room leaned closer, looking to him for confirmation, for denial, anything. A full minute passed. Then Langford finally spoke. I don't understand this last part, he admitted. Gasps rose from the audience. But Nico turned to him and pointed to the top left of the board. It loops, he said simply. The last line completes the pattern in the first. You're not supposed to go down. You're supposed to go around. Langford's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He turned back to the board. He read the final sequence again, now through the eyes of a loop, not a ladder, and it clicked. The solution was circular, recursive, not linear, a kind of answer no one had even considered. Langford stepped back. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. For a moment, he looked smaller than usual, less like a billionaire, more like a man who had just seen something impossible. Someone in the back of the room whispered, "Did he just solve it?" No one answered, because even those who doubted were now too afraid to speak. They didn't fear the boy. They feared what it meant, that a child with no degree, no access, no formal training, had just walked into their world and turned it upside down. And still, Nico stood there quietly. He wasn't smiling. He didn't understand the weight of what he'd done. To him, it was just another problem with a beautiful shape, just something he had to finish, like sweeping the last corner of a floor no one else cared to look at. The weight of silence inside Langford Tower's Grand Hall was unlike anything the guests had felt before. Not even during past summits featuring Nobel laureates had the air been this thick, this uncertain, because now the source of that pressure wasn't a professor with a dozen degrees, but janitor boy holding a marker. Mr. Langford slowly stood up from his chair. His expression was unreadable. His gaze moved from the board to Nico, then back to the room filled with stunned faces. He turned to the nearest professor and asked, "Do you see the logic?" Professor Meyer nodded hesitantly. "I do," he said. "I see it now. The circular sequence fits. It's genius, but it doesn't follow any known framework. It's like he built a new language just to speak this answer." Langford's voice grew quieter, almost like he was talking to himself. He built it from trash, from scraps of books, from broken pencils and napkins. No one knew what to say. A few people clapped, slowly, awkwardly, unsure whether celebration or shame was more appropriate, because in that moment, all their accolades, their awards, their exclusive access meant nothing. They hadn't solved the Langford problem. He had. From the side of the room, a tall man in a gray blazer stepped forward. He was one of Langford's personal legal advisors. He leaned in and spoke softly. "Do you want me to issue the reward, sir? The check can be printed within the hour." Langford didn't respond right away. His eyes were still on Nico. The boy had walked away from the board and now stood alone by the supply cart. His fingers wiped dry a small spot of ink from his wrist. He looked tired, not triumphant, just quietly done. Langford finally replied. "No," he said. A murmur of confusion spread. But then he continued, louder, "We will not print a check. Not yet." He stepped toward Nico, now standing in the center of the room again, all eyes on him. "I don't want to hand you a check, Nico. I want to ask you something first." Nico looked up, unsure how to respond. Langford paused. His next words came slowly. "How would you like to never sweep another floor again?" Gasps filled the hall. Langford continued. "You don't belong on the edges of genius. You are genius. You belong in it. I want you to work with me. I'll provide tutors, mentors, everything you need. You will never carry a mop again, unless you want to." Nico didn't answer immediately. He stared down at his worn shoes. The room held its breath. Finally, he looked up. "I just want to keep learning," he said quietly. "I don't care where." Langford gave a single nod. "Then we start today." A soft applause began, this time more sincere. It spread across the room, transforming into a standing ovation, not for Langford, not for the professors, but for the quiet boy who had just rewritten what possibility looked like. But for Nico, it was never about applause. It was about the numbers, the quiet logic that made everything finally make sense. Outside the towering glass walls of Langford Tower, the city buzzed as usual. Cars honked. People passed by without knowing that history had just shifted on the 32nd floor. But inside, the atmosphere remained thick with disbelief and quiet awe. The story was no longer contained within the room. A young intern, still trembling from what she had witnessed, uploaded a short video clip to her social media. It showed Nico writing on the board with professors surrounding him like students. The caption read, "A janitor just solved the Langford problem. No one saw it coming." Within minutes, the video began spreading. At first, just among university circles. Then mathematicians around the country began sharing it. Then journalists. Then celebrities. By the end of the hour, the janitor problem was trending on multiple platforms. News outlets scrambled for confirmation. Who was this boy? Was the solution real? Had Mr. Langford really been dethroned by a kid with a mop? Inside the hall, the applause had faded into conversation. The guests began breaking into smaller groups, each one debating the implications. Not just the math, but the shame. He never should have been sweeping in the first place, someone muttered. Professor Leung stood beside Nico, who was now sitting on a folding chair with a glass of water in his hand. She leaned down and asked, "Has anyone ever taught you formally?" He shook his head. "I tried once, but the teacher said I was going too fast. They thought I was showing off." She smiled sadly. "You weren't showing off. You were just ahead." Mr. Langford stepped back into view, now speaking with the television news crew that had just been let in. Lights flashed. Microphones extended toward him. He held up a hand and said, "You all came for a math story. You're leaving with something else." One reporter asked, "Is it true you're offering the boy a permanent position?" Langford hesitated, then smiled. "No," he said, "I'm not offering him a position. I'm offering him power. I'm going to fund anything he wants to learn, build, or explore. And if anyone here thinks that's excessive, let me remind you, this boy solved something no one else in this building could." The cameras turned to Nico, who was now surrounded by a small circle of stunned reporters. He looked uncomfortable, not knowing where to look or what to say. One journalist asked gently, "What's your dream, Nico?" He blinked, then shrugged. "I just wanted to see if I was right." That answer, simple as it was, would become the quote printed in every newspaper the next day. "I just want to see if I was right." It was more than a quote. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth that made the world uneasy. That talent and genius don't always come with degrees, wealth, or polish. Sometimes they come with broken pencils and crumpled napkins. And sometimes they mopped the floor before they solved the problem of the decade. The sun had begun to set behind the skyscrapers, painting the glass walls of Langford Tower in shades of orange and gold. But the light inside the building now came from something else entirely. The glow of screens, the blinking of news cameras, and the spark in hundreds of eyes watching a boy who should have been invisible. Nico sat quietly on a long leather bench just outside the main hall. His shoes didn't quite touch the floor. He held the same napkin from earlier, now slightly torn and smudged, staring at the faded numbers on it. He wasn't sure what had changed, only that everything had. Inside, Mr. Langford was on his third press conference in a row. He had just received a phone call from the National Science Foundation, followed by an invitation from the Ministry of Education. More were calling. More wanted to meet the boy. But Nico didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't even speak. He just stared at the paper, until someone approached. A woman in her 50s, with dark skin and bright silver glasses, walked up and sat beside him. She introduced herself in a low voice. "My name is Dr. Sandrine Mari. I work with a group of theoretical mathematicians in Switzerland. We don't work for a university. We work in patterns too dangerous for the public." Nico looked at her, curious. She continued, "We just saw your solution. All of it. Live stream. One of our members was watching. We've never seen logic move like that." Nico said nothing. Then she leaned closer. "Would you like to come to the mountains?" she asked. "We'll show you the rest of the equation you didn't even know you were solving." Nico blinked slowly. "There's more." She smiled. "There's always more." From a few feet away, Langford saw them speaking. His face didn't betray emotion, but his fingers clenched slightly around the tablet he held. For the first time, he realized something he hadn't thought about until now. He might not be able to keep Nico, because the world was watching, and the world was starting to reach for him. Later that night, as the building emptied out, Nico walked out alone. No cameras followed him. He wore the same mop-stained uniform and carried a worn-out backpack with only one strap left. But when he stepped out onto the sidewalk, a small group of students were waiting. They had printed his face on their phone screens. One girl approached him and said, "My brother couldn't solve that problem. He said it was impossible. But you did. Can I shake your hand?" Nico hesitated, then held out his hand. Her fingers trembled as she touched his. It wasn't because he was famous. It was because he had broken the wall. He had shown the world that genius wasn't always behind podiums or in labs with perfect lighting. Sometimes, genius wore rubber gloves and stayed late to clean what others left behind. The next morning, Langford Tower looked different. Security had tripled. Journalists lined the streets. Drones hovered overhead. A sea of curious onlookers stood behind barricades, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy who had solved the unsolvable. Inside the building, Mr. Langford stood at the top floor, staring out over the city. His expression was blank. His phone kept buzzing. Calls from universities, think tanks, government agencies, even foreign ambassadors. Everyone wanted access. Everyone wanted Nico, but Nico wasn't answering. He hadn't come to the tower that morning. He hadn't responded to Langford's invitation, or to the carefully worded messages his staff had sent to the shelter where Nico lived. Langford was not used to being ignored. He turned to his assistant. "Send the car again," he said. "Make sure it waits." Meanwhile, across the city, in a quiet room at the shelter, Nico sat on the floor with a stack of old math books spread around him. Not the fancy ones people had suddenly offered him. These were the ones he trusted. Water damage, coverless, salvaged from university trash bins. He wasn't avoiding Langford out of disrespect. He was thinking, and for the first time in his life, he had to think not just about numbers, but about people. What would they do with his mind? What would they expect from it? What would they take? His fingers brushed over the napkin he'd used the day before. It was now placed gently between the pages of a book titled Beyond Infinity, a book he didn't fully understand. Not yet, but one that made him feel like something was waiting just beyond the edge of the known. Suddenly, the shelter door creaked open. It was Dr. Sandrine Maury. She stepped in without saying a word and placed a small envelope on the floor beside him. Inside, a single page, handwritten equations, strange, curved symbols, unfamiliar but beautiful. A note at the bottom read, "We've been waiting for someone who thinks in spirals. If you want to learn what Langford never saw, meet us at Terminal 7, midnight." Nico looked up at her. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and turned away. He didn't call after her, because in that moment, the decision had already been made. Back at Langford Tower, the billionaire sat alone in the main hall. The whiteboard from yesterday was still untouched. No one had dared erase the boy's work. Langford stared at it for a long time. He knew what the world would say, that he had discovered a genius, that he had nurtured it. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't discovered Nico. He had simply been lucky enough to watch him work before the rest of the world reached out and took him away. Terminal 7 was nearly empty. A thin fog hung just above the asphalt outside, blurring the runway lights in the distance. The cold glass door slid open with a low hiss as Nico stepped inside. Wearing the same faded hoodie he always wore on night walks. He carried nothing but a worn backpack and the envelope from Dr. Maury. There were no reporters here, no audience, just a quiet, dim terminal and a private gate guarded by a single man in a dark coat. The man didn't ask for ID. He simply looked at Nico, nodded once, then pointed down the hall. Nico walked slowly. Every step sounded louder than it should have. At the far end, he found Dr. Maury seated near the window, watching a sleek black jet on the tarmac. She didn't turn when he approached. She only said, "Did you bring it?" Nico reached into his pocket and pulled out the napkin. Dr. Maury turned to look at it. Her eyes softened. "You want to keep that," she said. "That's your first map." Nico sat beside her. "I don't understand all of it yet," he admitted. She smiled faintly. "You're not supposed to. Not yet. The kind of math you're walking into, it doesn't live in equations. It lives in questions no one's allowed to ask." Outside, the plane's door opened. A man in a long coat stepped out and stood silently beside the stairs. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He was simply waiting. Dr. Maury, rose from her chair. "The others are already there," she said. "People like you. Hidden, misunderstood, dangerous to the wrong kind of order." Nico stood slowly. He looked at the jet, then back toward the terminal entrance, toward the world he was leaving behind. The mop, the empty cafeteria, the trash bins behind Jefferson College, the tower that offered him everything. Too late. Then he looked at Dr. Murray. "Will I get to solve harder problems?" She grinned. "There are problems so hard, Nico, they change the people who solve them." The engines began to hum. As Nico stepped onto the jet, no cameras followed, no headlines flashed, no applause echoed, just silence. And above that silence, the distant pulse of something bigger, the sound of a mind stepping into a space where the rules were not yet written. Back at Langford Tower, Mr. Langford sat alone in the grand hall once more. The janitor's whiteboard had been covered with glass, preserved like a relic, a symbol of something that had slipped through his fingers. He thought he had created the challenge, but it was the boy who had issued one to the world. And now he was gone. But the question he left behind would echo louder than any solution. Who else had we overlooked? The jet flew through the night like a shadow that refused to be seen. No announcement, no destination on public records, no seats for tourists. Just silence, stars, and the soft hum of a machine carrying the world's most unlikely mathematician towards something far stranger than a prize or a paycheck. Hours later, the plane landed on a narrow strip carved into the side of a mountain. The fog was thicker here, the sky darker. A sharp wind cut through the trees as Nico stepped out onto solid ground. He had never seen snow fall this gently, like numbers from a dream drifting into place. A narrow tunnel greeted him. Smooth concrete, dimly lit and utterly silent. At the end of that tunnel stood an iron door. Beside it, a keypad. Dr. Murray walked ahead and placed her palm against the glass. The door opened. Inside was not a laboratory, not a classroom, but a vast, circular space filled with chalkboards and worn couches. Scattered across the room were 6 people, all different ages, all seated alone, eyes locked onto walls covered in formulas and wild, spiraling diagrams. No introductions were made. No one looked up. They didn't need to. They had been expecting him. Dr. Murray led Nico to a small wooden desk at the far corner of the room. On it sat only a blank notebook, a pen, and a phrase carved into surface. "Don't answer the question. Rebuild it." She spoke quietly. "You're not here to memorize. You're not here to impress. You're here to think, to ruin the old roads, and if you're lucky, build new ones." Then she left. For the next hour, Nico sat in silence. He didn't write. He didn't speak. He watched, and slowly, something began to take shape in his mind. Not a number, not a shape, but a problem. One he had never dared to name, the kind that scared even his dreams. And then, without realizing it, he smiled, because he finally felt home. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the world was still trying to catch up. Langford Tower had become a tourist site overnight. Mathematicians, students, and engineers made pilgrimages just to stand in front of a glass seal board where Nico's solution was preserved. Universities offered full scholarships. Tech giants made public offers. Politicians gave speeches about nurturing hidden minds. But Nico was gone. No reply, no forwarding address, just a board, and a single phrase that Langford had ordered engraved beneath the glass. He didn't apply for permission. He solved it anyway. Days turned into weeks. Inside the secluded facility in the mountains, Nico barely noticed time. The clocks there didn't tick. There were no bells, no tests, no scheduled meals, only questions, and the freedom to follow them. He began to develop a new kind of problem, one that no one had assigned to him. It started from something small, just a curiosity buried inside a forgotten equation scrawled on the back of a board. But the more he stared at it, the more it felt alive. He didn't solve it. He chased it. Others noticed. Not with words. This place was nearly wordless. But one afternoon, a woman with silver hair left a folded paper on his desk. No signature. Just 4 lines of equations that mirrored his idea, extended it, and twisted it. It was a challenge, a reply, a silent nod of respect. For the first time in his life, Nico wasn't alone in the way he thought. And that's when something shifted. On the fourth Monday, after a night without sleep, he ran to the large circular blackboard in the center of the room and began writing rapidly. The others slowly turned from their work and watched. His chalk flew across the board, forming spirals, equations, inverse curves, a shape made not from geometry, but from logic. Then he stopped. One of the older men approached. He pointed at a line in the lower corner and said, "That's not stable." Nico shook his head. "It's not supposed to be." The man raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "It breaks the system," Nico replied. "But if the system breaks the same way every time, that's still a pattern." And the room fell still, because in that one sentence, Nico had touched something many of them had avoided: controlled instability. A new branch of thought, one that didn't fear failure, but mapped it, measured it, used it. That same night, Dr. Murray sent a single encrypted message to an old colleague. "He's moving faster than we predicted, not just solving, inventing frameworks." Back in the world outside, the legend of the janitor problem had taken on a life of its own. Universities now taught seminars dissecting Nico's solution. Langford had launched a scholarship fund in his name, and conspiracy theories began to swirl. Some claimed Nico never existed, that he was an invention by Langford to promote his think tank. Others believed he had been recruited by a secret division of a world government. A few went as far as to say the boy was a machine, a product of advanced artificial intelligence disguised in human form. None of them knew the truth, and that was what made the story even more powerful. Because while they argued over what he was building something new. And no one, not Langford, not the universities, not the media, could see where it would lead. Not yet, but deep in the mountain, where the wind never reached and the silence was sacred, the first crack had formed in a wall the world once thought unbreakable. And Nico was ready to go through it. Snow began falling heavier outside the mountain facility. Thick layers coated the pine trees like static on an old television screen, as if the world beyond had paused. But inside, something was beginning to stir, not with sound, but with tension. The room was quieter than usual. Even the scratching of chalk had stopped. Everyone could feel it. Nico's board, the one he had quietly claimed as his own, was now filled from edge to edge. No symmetry, no title, no explanation. Just a web of numbers, vectors, curved lines, and recursive notations that seemed to stretch beyond the border of the board itself. It didn't look like a solution. It looked like a signal. That afternoon, Dr. Murray approached the center of the room. She didn't speak immediately. She studied the board for a full minute before finally turning to Nico. "What are you building?" Nico was seated cross-legged on the floor, sketching on his notebook. He looked up and answered simply, "I don't know yet." That answer, vague and unthreatening, carried more weight than anything he'd said since his arrival, because the others had started to notice something deeply unsettling. The math on Nico's board was reacting, not in the supernatural sense, not visibly moving, but it changed depending on how one approached it. When you looked at it from the left, the central equation appeared to resolve into a stable function, but from the right, it dissolved into pure noise. One researcher called it an observer anomaly. Another called it cognitive mirroring. Nico called it thinking backward. And that concept alone had caused one of the older mathematicians to leave the facility for good. He didn't say why. He just packed quietly and left a single word on the chalkboard near the door. Unnatural. The remaining members didn't argue, because deep down, even they could feel it. This wasn't just genius. This was something else. A way of seeing mathematics that didn't fit into equations, journals, or even human comfort. Something that made the rules tremble slightly, like a door being pushed open from the other side, slowly, patiently. And Nico was standing at the threshold. Dr. Murray didn't stop him. She never had. Instead, she gave him a piece of chalk with a gold-painted tip, the symbol of the last challenge, the one question no member had ever dared complete. And without being told, Nico took the chalk. He walked toward the empty wall. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes. And then, slowly, he drew a spiral. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Mr. Langford was woken by a phone call. The voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in years, a former colleague from the quantum systems lab in Iceland. "You need to see this," the voice said. Langford, still groggy, asked what was happening. The voice didn't answer directly. It simply forwarded a file. Inside the file, a photograph. It was grainy, taken from a camera inside a snow-covered research facility. The image showed a chalkboard. At the center of that board, the same spiral. Langford's hands trembled. He recognized it, because it was the exact same shape he had once dismissed from an abandoned experiment. He never solved it. He never even understood it. But now, the boy had found it, and it had come back to life. The spiral on the wall wasn't just strange. It was impossible. Its form defied the constraints of traditional geometry. At first glance, it resembled the golden ratio, then morphed into a logarithmic curve. But when traced from outside in, the ratios flipped in a pattern that did not converge nor diverge. It looped without ever repeating. By daybreak, every researcher in the facility had gathered in front of Nico's board. Some stood in silence. Others whispered numbers under their breath, tried to identify its structure. But no matter how long they stared, the spiral gave nothing away. Only Nico moved with ease around it. He added no labels, no definitions, just expansions, tiny, delicate annotations around the curve, half symbols, half instinct, like someone sketching the shape of a dream before it faded. Dr. Morit stood to the side, eyes narrowed. "Has he gone too far?" one of the senior members whispered. She didn't reply, because she didn't know. They had all been trained to search for patterns. But Nico wasn't searching anymore. He was building the thing that held the patterns. Not the answer, the frame. That morning, the temperature in the facility dropped lower than usual. The power flickered twice. A light in the far hallway died, without explanation. And then, the board began to reflect. Just slightly, barely visible, but enough for one of the physicists to notice that his own face had bent in the curved glass of the chalkboard. "It's warping," he whispered. "Not the surface. The way the light bounces off it." Another took out a small laser pointer. He traced the spiral with the beam. The red dot trembled, then vanished at the center. Gone. No reflection. No scatter. Just gone. That night, Dr. Mari called an emergency meeting in the chamber downstairs. Only 5 attended, those still capable of rational speech. Others had stopped speaking entirely, choosing instead to sit alone in their quarters, sketching spirals with shaking hands. "We must close the sequence," she said. "But it hasn't finished," one replied. "That's the point," she answered. She slid a folder across the table. Inside, images of seismic activity near the mountain. Tiny vibrations that had started after the spiral was drawn. Not tectonic. Not explainable. This isn't just math anymore. Upstairs, Nico sat alone with the board. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. His eyes reflected only the curve, like he was staring into something remembering itself. Then, as the wind outside howled louder than ever before, Nico pressed a single chalk mark at the very center of the spiral. The end. He stepped back. The chalk fell from his hand and rolled across the floor. And for the first time since he arrived, Nico looked afraid. Far away, in a dim office surrounded by locked drawers and redacted files, Mr. Langford watched the live feed in silence. The spiral glowed faintly on screen. The image trembled. Langford leaned closer and whispered to no one, "What have you done, boy?" The spiral no longer belonged to the chalkboard. It had outgrown the surface, the room, the building, maybe even the mind that created it. When Nico placed the final dot at the center, something subtle but irreversible shifted. The air changed. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like gravity remembering where it came from. He stood motionless. The room around him faded from awareness. The spiral no longer looked like an equation. It looked like a decision. From outside, snow slammed against the windows. Lights flickered in the hallway. Deep underground, Power systems began rerouting themselves without command. Dr. Morit sprinted into the room. "Nico!" she shouted, louder than she ever had. He didn't move. She grabbed his arm. His skin was warm, but his eyes were vacant, focused on something far past the wall. The other researchers began pouring in, most of them breathless, a few crying. One man dropped to his knees and mumbled incoherently in a mix of languages. It was no longer about mathematics. The spiral had pulled something through. Not a ghost, not a voice, an idea. It spread without sound, without form. But every mind in the room felt it pressing inward, gently at first, then with increasing urgency, like a door opening in reverse. One by one, chalkboards cracked. Laptops died. Power surged. Dr. Morit slammed the emergency panel beside the door, triggering lockdown. Thick metal walls began to slide down over the exits. But just before the last gate sealed, she made a choice she would never explain. She pulled Nico into the secured central chamber and shut the blast door behind them. Inside the silence, Nico finally blinked. "What happened?" he whispered. Dr. Morit didn't answer. She simply stood facing him, her face pale, her voice steady only, because it had to be. "You touched the core," she said. Nico frowned. "The center?" "No, the core, the thing that builds the rules. The thing the rest of us can only study through shadows." Nico shook his head, confused. "I just followed the pattern." Dr. Morit stepped forward slowly. "And it led you to a place that was never meant to be seen from this side." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small metal case. Inside it, a folded sheet of paper, covered in numbers. Primitive, handwritten, but unmistakably part of his work, drawn decades ago by the first mathematician who had glimpsed the spiral and gone mad. "You've continued something that was buried," she said. "I didn't mean to." "I know." Thousands of miles away, Mr. Langford sat alone in his underground vault. He had disconnected all communications, destroyed all backups, and yet the spiral appeared on every monitor, even ones that weren't connected. He whispered he solved the unsolvable. But it wasn't just a problem. It was a lock. And the boy had opened it. Back in the chamber, Nico finally spoke. His voice was quiet, clear. "I can't finish it." Dr. Morit stared at him. He looked at her, because it's not supposed to end. He turned slowly toward the blank wall beside the sealed chalkboard. He picked up a fresh stick of chalk and drew the first line of a new spiral. Smaller, simpler, gentler, but still alive. And in that final moment, with only darkness around him, no audience, no applause, no billionaire, Nico smiled. Not because he had answers, but because the universe had whispered something back. Not a number, not a truth, just a question he hadn't asked yet, and he was ready to follow it.